knowing him as I know him, and he's one of the greatest men I've ever met in my life, and my best friend, and great father to my children.
From royal luxury to a cheap seaside lodge, Sarah Ferguson's fall has been shocking, fast, and very hard to look away from. The woman who once had everything is now living like someone who lost it all overnight. Because she did. What really happened behind the scenes? How does a duchess end up hiding in plain sight? Join us as we uncover the full story of her astonishing collapse. From royal spotlight to running scared, the collapse begins. Some people walk into a room and everyone turns to look. Sarah Ferguson was always that kind of person. Warm, loud, hard to ignore. For years she managed to stay relevant, stay visible, and stay in the conversation even after leaving royal life behind. That was her skill, staying in the picture no matter what. Then, in early 2026, she vanished. The reason was impossible to miss. Late Prince Andrew had been arrested, and the story had exploded across every news outlet in the world. Cameras that had been pointed at him immediately started looking for her. Journalists wanted to know where she was, what she knew, and what she planned to say about the man she had once married and never truly walked away from. She said nothing, she went nowhere. Her private accounts were reportedly froze without warning. The public image she had spent years carefully building, the television appearances, the charity work, the comeback story, she had told so many times it had become her identity, started falling apart faster than anyone around her could manage. Then the emails came out. Not all at once, but piece by piece, the way truly damaging information always tends to surface. Slowly enough to keep people guessing, deep but steadily enough that the questions kept growing louder. People close to her described the atmosphere inside her inner circle as panic that was rapidly running out of places to hide. The story she had told the world about herself for decades, the resilient duchess, the survivor, the woman who turned embarrassment into a brand, was cracking open in front of everyone. The woman who had never struggled to stay in the spotlight was now doing everything she could to get out of it. What was inside those emails that made her run so fast? The 16,000 pounds a day illusion. Luxury couldn't save her. When powerful people fall apart, they do not do it cheaply. At least not at first. The instinct when everything starts collapsing is to reach for the most expensive version of stability available. To surround yourself with enough luxury that the chaos outside the walls feels temporarily manageable. For Sarah Ferguson, that instinct reportedly led her to Switzerland. The clinics she allegedly retreated to in the early weeks of the crisis were not ordinary facilities. These were places built specifically for people with enormous wealth and an urgent need for privacy. Discreet locations tucked into the Swiss landscape, staffed by professionals who understood that their clients were not just unwell, they were exposed, and that discretion was as important as any medical service on offer. The kind of places where the daily rate ran to 16,000 pounds, and nobody asked uncomfortable questions. It sounds like safety. In reality, it was a clock ticking very loudly. Because the money that had always allowed Sarah Ferguson to access this level of comfort had not just slowed down in the weeks following Andrew's arrest and the email revelations. It had stopped. The sponsors who had quietly funded her lifestyle were pulling back. The business relationships that had kept her financially afloat were cooling rapidly. The infrastructure of income that she had built around her personal brand was dismantling itself in real time, and no amount of Swiss discretion could pause that process while she recovered. People who know how these elite recovery facilities work describe a very particular dynamic. They are wonderful places as long as the payments keep arriving. The moment they do not, the warmth evaporates with a speed that would surprise people who had never experienced it. So these are businesses first and sanctuaries second. And Sarah Ferguson was discovering that distinction at the worst possible moment. The gap between the life she was still trying to maintain and the financial reality closing in around her had become impossible to bridge. She was sitting in one of the most expensive environments in the world, while the money required to stay there quietly disappeared. Every day inside those walls cost more than most people earn in months, and the accounts funding those days were running dry. The Switzerland chapter did not end on her terms. It ended because it had to, because the illusion of luxury as a solution requires one thing above everything else to keep functioning. It requires money, and hers had run out. The question that followed her out of those clinic doors was not where she would recover. It was where she could afford to go at all. The answer shocked everyone who heard it. From palace life to 113 pounds a night. There is a particular kind of shock that comes not from a single dramatic event, but from a contrast so sharp it takes a moment to fully process. Sarah Ferguson had lived inside royal palaces. She had occupied spaces that most people will only ever see in photographs, rooms filled with centuries of history, staffed by people whose entire professional purpose was anticipating her needs before she had fully formed them herself. The modest seaside lodge on the Irish coast, where she reportedly surfaced in early 2026, cost 113 pounds a night. Sit with that contrast for a moment.
Pick her because it tells you everything about how completely and how quickly her world had inverted. This was not a countryside retreat chosen for its charm. This was not a wellness escape selected from a curated list of boutique hideaways. This was a place chosen because it was available, affordable, and most importantly, because nobody would think to look for her there. The locals certainly did not expect her. Small coastal communities in Ireland are not unaccustomed to visitors, but they are accustomed to a certain kind of visitor. Walkers, families, people seeking quiet. Not former members of the British royal family, arriving with the weight of an international scandal pressing down on them. When word spread quietly that the woman checking into the modest lodge was who people thought she was, the reaction was less excitement and more bewilderment. What was she doing there? The question was reasonable because nothing about her presence made obvious sense to people seeing it from the outside. She was not hiding in the conventional sense, in some remote location, accessible only to those with specific knowledge of her whereabouts. She was hiding in plain sight, in a public accommodation in a small community, banking on the assumption that the very ordinariness of her surroundings would provide a kind of camouflage that expensive privacy could no longer offer. It was a calculated move. The Switzerland option was gone. The circle of wealthy friends and supporters who might have provided a more comfortable alternative had grown noticeably smaller in the weeks since the emails surfaced. The options available to her had narrowed to a point that would have been unimaginable to the woman she had been even 12 months earlier. Royal life had given her a very specific understanding of what comfort looked like and what she deserved. That understanding had not changed. Her circumstances had changed completely around it, leaving a gap between expectation and reality that a 113-pound lodge could not even begin to fill. She had not chosen this life. She had been pushed into it by a collapse she was still struggling to fully understand. The real question was not why she was there. Hiding isn't about money, it's about what she said. Money problems can be managed. They are painful and humiliating, and they close doors in ways that take years to reopen, but they are manageable. People rebuild from financial collapse all the time. They restructure, they rebrand, they find new income streams and new supporters, and they move forward. Sarah Ferguson had done exactly that before, more than once, emerging from very public financial difficulty with her reputation bruised but intact. What was happening in 2026 was different. This was not primarily a money problem. The financial collapse was real, and it was serious, but it was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was something far more difficult to treat because you cannot restructure your way out of your own words. The emails that had begun surfacing in the weeks following Andrew's arrest were not just embarrassing. They were dangerous in a very specific and targeted way. Because they did not reveal financial impropriety or personal indiscretion of the kind that public figures routinely survive with the right crisis management team and a carefully timed apology. They threatened to reveal something considerably more damaging. The distance between what Sarah Ferguson had said publicly and what she had apparently said privately was becoming harder to maintain with every new fragment that emerged. Digital evidence does not age. It does not soften with time or become less precise with repetition. It sits exactly where it was created, carrying every word at full weight, waiting for the moment when someone with access and motivation decides to release it. The court proceedings connected to the broader Epstein fallout had created exactly that kind of moment. And the material emerging from those proceedings was landing with a force that her public relations operation was visibly struggling to absorb. The clash between her public image and her private communications was not a subtle one. For years, she had presented herself to the world as someone who had been naive, perhaps in her associations,
but never complicit, never aware of the full picture, always ultimately on the right side of the moral line. That presentation had been accepted widely enough to allow her to continue building her brand, her charity work, her television projects, her carefully maintained public presence. The emails suggested a different version, not a naive woman caught at the edges of something she did not understand, but someone whose private views diverged from her public statements in ways that were very difficult to explain away. She was not hiding because she had run out of money. She was hiding because of what she had said when she believed nobody outside her inner circle would ever hear it. What those words actually was about to change everything. The Epstein emails. The words that destroyed everything. There are moments in a public scandal when a single piece of evidence changes the entire shape of the story, not because it answers every question, but because it makes the questions impossible to ignore any longer. For Sarah Ferguson, that moment came when specific fragments of her private communications began circulating in legal and media circles. Yes, and the content of those fragments landed with a force that no prepared statement could absorb. The allegations surrounding the leaked emails are explosive in their specificity. According to reports, the communications in question did not simply show a woman maintaining loyalty to a difficult friend. They allegedly showed something considerably more troubling, suggestions that she had actively facilitated connections between Epstein and individuals within her social circle, language that, if verified, would place her not at the innocent edges of his world, but uncomfortably close to its functioning center. Then came the message that reportedly stopped people cold. A fragment described by sources familiar with the material, in which Ferguson allegedly referred to Epstein in terms that made clear she did not share the public characterization of him as a predator. The reported phrase, a variation of the sentiment that she would not use the language the world was using to describe him, suggested that her private view of Jeffrey Epstein bore very little resemblance to the carefully distanced public position she had maintained since his first arrest in 2008. Sit with that for a moment. This was a woman who had spent years presenting herself as someone who had been naive about Epstein's true nature, someone who regretted the association and had moved firmly away from it. If the emails said something different, if they suggested that privately she had defended him, refused to condemn him, and maintained a view of him that contradicted everything she had said publicly, then the entire foundation of her public rehabilitation was built on something that was not true. The reaction when these fragments began circulating was immediate and unforgiving. People who had previously extended her the benefit of the doubt found that benefit exhausted very quickly. Supporters who had stood beside her through previous controversies went quiet with a speed that communicated everything about how serious this particular revelation felt. Her public outrage about Epstein, the carefully worded statements, the strategic distancing, the performance of moral clarity, suddenly looked exactly like what the emails allegedly suggested it had always been. A performance, not a genuine reckoning, not an honest acknowledgement. Thus, a calculated presentation designed to protect a brand while private communications told an entirely different story. If her public stance was constructed rather than genuine, the question that followed was one she had no clean answer for. What else had she been performing all along? Begging for survival, the royal who needed a paycheck. There is a version of financial difficulty that carries a certain dignified sadness. The kind where someone who once had everything quietly adjusts their circumstances, makes private sacrifices, and faces their reduced reality with the kind of grace that earns sympathy rather than judgment. That version exists. It is real, and it is genuinely painful to witness. What was reportedly happening with Sarah Ferguson in the months surrounding the 2026 collapse was something rawer and considerably less dignified than that. Because the financial desperation being described by sources close to the situation was not the quiet kind, it was urgent, visible to those around her, and reportedly led her to make approaches that, when they became known, raised questions that went far beyond simple money trouble. Reports emerged that Ferguson had allegedly sought financial assistance from individuals connected to the world she had publicly distanced herself from. The specifics, as reported across multiple independent sources, pointed to requests for employment or financial support directed toward a disgraced financier whose own legal troubles were still unresolved. The kind of approach that, in ordinary circumstances, a person with her public profile and reputational concerns would never make. Except, these were not ordinary circumstances. The income streams that had kept her financially functional had collapsed. The brand partnerships were gone. The business ventures that had provided revenue were shutting down. Now, the safety net that proximity to the royal family had always quietly provided was no longer there in any meaningful way. She was not navigating a temporary cash flow problem. She was facing the kind of financial reality that required immediate solutions, regardless of how those solutions looked to the outside world. The desperation visible in those alleged approaches tells its own story. This was not a woman carefully managing a difficult financial period with the resources and support network available to someone of her background. This was a woman running out of options in real time, reaching toward any available handhold regardless of what grabbing it would eventually cost her. For people who had watched her navigate previous financial crises, this felt different. Previous difficulties had been managed with a degree of control, with the infrastructure of royal-adjacent life providing enough cushion to prevent genuine freefall. That cushion was gone. The infrastructure had been removed. What remained was a woman with expensive habits, a collapsing income, and a shrinking list of people willing to help her without conditions attached. Just how long this financial crisis had been quietly building beneath the polished surface of her public life was a question nobody around her had wanted to answer honestly. The answer, it turned out, was much longer than anyone had admitted. The brand execution, corporate world. Pulls the plug reputations in the modern world do not die slowly. They do not fade gracefully over years of declining relevance, giving the person at the center time to adjust and adapt and find a quieter way to exist. In the age of instant information and corporate risk management, reputations can be destroyed in a single news cycle, and the people and companies attached to them move with a speed that feels almost clinical in its efficiency. Sarah Ferguson had built something genuinely impressive over the years following her departure from royal life. A personal brand that had survived multiple public humiliations, financial scandals, and media pile-ons that would have finished most public figures permanently. She had reinvented herself as an author, a television personality, a charity advocate, a wellness ambassador. She had found ways to monetize her name and her story, and her particular brand of resilient energy that kept her financially relevant long after most people had written her off. The corporate world had tolerated a great deal from that brand over the years, because the audience she could reach and the goodwill she could generate still represented value. Tolerating a complicated history was a straightforward business calculation, as long as the numbers justified it. The emails changed the calculation completely. Within days of the most damaging fragments circulating, the response from sponsors and partners was not cautious or measured or carefully worded. It was fast. Companies that had maintained relationships with Ferguson through previous controversies began issuing termination notices with a speed that suggested the decisions had required very little internal debate. The language used was consistent across multiple statements. Words like values and alignment and community standards appearing in announcement after announcement as organizations placed as much visible distance between themselves and her name as quickly as their legal teams could manage. For Ferguson, the speed of the corporate withdrawal was itself a message. These were not partners reluctantly concluding that the association had become untenable. So these were businesses executing a risk management decision that had probably been drafted and sitting in a folder somewhere, waiting for exactly this kind of trigger to activate it. Her name, which had been an asset for so long, had become a liability almost overnight. Not a complicated liability that required careful weighing of pros and cons. A straightforward one that required only the speed of a signature. The public backlash amplified everything. Social media commentary that might once have been managed or redirected became impossible to contain. Every new statement from a departing partner generated fresh waves of coverage that kept the story alive and the pressure building. When your entire income depends on your image, the moment that image becomes radioactive is not just a reputational crisis, it is a financial execution. The execution in this case was just getting started. 6 companies gone. In 1 week, total financial collapse. There is a difference between a business having a bad week and a business empire being dismantled. A bad week produces problems that Monday morning meetings and damage control strategies can address. A dismantling produces something else entirely, a silence where activity used to be. Empty calendars where commitments used to sit. A name that used to open doors now causing those same doors to close before the knock is finished. Yet for Sarah Ferguson, the week that changed everything arrived without warning and ended with a finality that left even her harshest critics momentarily speechless. 6 companies gone, not struggling, not restructuring, not pausing operations pending a review, gone, shut down, dissolved, or abandoned in a concentrated period that compressed years of business effort into days of erasure. The ventures that disappeared were not minor side projects casually attached to her name for marketing purposes. They represented years of work, years of relationship building, years of the kind of persistent effort that had kept her financially functional through every previous storm: wellness initiatives, media projects, publishing arrangements, and partnerships built on the commercial value of her story and her reach, and the audience that had followed her through decades of very public reinvention. That audience had not disappeared, but its relationship with her name had changed in a way that made it commercially useless to the businesses that had previously relied on it. An audience that had once generated goodwill and purchasing decisions was now generating something else entirely: scrutiny and questions. Association with a story that no brand wanted attached to its product or its image or its carefully maintained relationship with its customers. Each closure landed as its own separate blow, but the cumulative effect of 6 happening within the same week created something beyond the sum of its parts. It created a narrative, a visible, undeniable, publicly documented story of total commercial collapse that traveled across media channels with the kind of momentum that press releases and spokesperson statements cannot slow. People who had worked with her, built things with her, invested their own professional credibility in association with her name. I watched the week unfold with a helplessness that several sources described as genuinely distressing. Not because they had been deceived, but because the speed of the collapse made it clear that no individual decision or relationship could have stopped what was happening. This was systemic, total, the kind of failure that does not leave useful pieces behind. Years of effort reduced to a series of closure announcements posted across business registers and social media accounts in the same week that the emails had made her name impossible to defend. The empire was gone. Every income stream she had carefully constructed had been wiped clean in days. Then came the one loss that hurt differently from all the others. Charity shut down. The final piece falls apart. There are things that people hold on to through every stage of a public collapse because they represent something beyond money or status or professional relevance. They represent identity, the proof that beneath the scandal and the headlines and the failed business ventures, there is still something genuinely good worth defending. For Sarah Ferguson, that thing was her charity work. Through every previous crisis, the charitable dimension of her public life had survived. Financial difficulties had come and gone. Media pile-ons had peaked and subsided. Royal relationships had fractured and partially healed. Through all of it, the charity work had remained, providing both a practical income-adjacent function and something considerably more important to her self-image. It was the part of her story she told with genuine feeling, the evidence she pointed to when the world questioned her value and her integrity and her right to continued public relevance. When her global charity closed its doors in 2026, the timing was not coincidental. It aligned with brutal precision to the email revelations, arriving in the immediate aftermath of the most damaging disclosures, as if the association between her private communications and her public humanitarian mission had made the charity itself impossible to sustain. Donors who had previously supported her work quietly withdrew. Institutional partners who had lent their credibility to her initiatives stepped back with the same speed that had characterized every other withdrawal in the preceding weeks. The closure was not announced with drama. There was no press conference, no detailed explanation, no carefully worded statement acknowledging what the shutdown represented. It simply stopped. The website went quiet. The social media accounts that had documented years of charitable activity fell silent. The machinery of an organization that had operated across multiple countries and touched thousands of lives powered down without the public acknowledgement that its significance perhaps deserved. For people who had worked within the charity, the closure carried a particular grief. The work had been real. The impact had been genuine. Whatever the questions surrounding its founder, The programs it had delivered and the people it had reached represented something that existed entirely independently of the scandal-consuming Sarah Ferguson's personal reputation. That work ended not because it had failed on its own terms, but because the name attached to it had become a weight it could no longer carry. No companies, no partnerships, no charity, no income streams of any meaningful kind remaining. The entire infrastructure of her public life had been removed piece by piece until nothing was left standing. She had spent decades building something from the wreckage of her royal departure. In a matter of weeks, it had become wreckage again. With everything gone, the question was no longer what she would lose next. It was what, if anything, she had left at all. The quiet end, a royal left with nothing but silence. There is a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself. No final confrontation, no dramatic last act. Why, no moment where everything comes to a head and the story resolves itself cleanly in one direction or another. Just a gradual quieting, a shrinking of the world until what remains is so small and so still that the silence itself becomes the loudest thing left. That is where Sarah Ferguson found herself in the weeks following the total collapse of everything she had built. The Irish Lodge, the modest surroundings, the absence of the staff, the schedules, the infrastructure of a life that had once operated on a scale most people cannot imagine. Gone. Not temporarily paused, not restructured into something more manageable, simply gone. The royal safety net that had always existed somewhere beneath her, even during the difficult years, even after the divorce, even through the financial crises and the media storms, had been quietly removed. The institution that had tolerated her complications for decades had reached a point where tolerance was no longer a position it was willing to maintain. The palace had stepped back with a finality that left no room for the kind of partial rehabilitation she had managed before. Investigations were ongoing. The legal questions connected to the email revelations had not resolved themselves with the closure of her businesses or the shutdown of her charity. They followed her to Ireland with the same persistence that everything else had followed her. Patient, unhurried, indifferent to her attempts to find distance from them. The circle of people around her had shrunk to almost nothing. Not because those people were cruel, but because association with her name now carried consequences that most were no longer willing to absorb. She had lost the businesses, she had lost the charity, she had lost the income, the partnerships, the royal adjacency that had defined her public identity for 30 years. What the emails had taken from her in the end was not just money or status or professional relevance. They had taken the one thing she had spent her entire public life trying to protect, the belief, however complicated, that she was someone the world could trust. That was gone now, quietly, completely. And in the silence of a modest Irish lodge, perhaps permanently,